So after the horrific crash in Washington, D.C. last week, President Trump made some remarks about DEI and ATC hiring standards and how they may have played an impact. A lot of people lost their minds over this. So let's talk about it.
We must have only the highest standards for those who work in our aviation system. I changed the Obama standards from very mediocre at best to extraordinary. You remember that. Only the highest aptitude, they have to be the highest intellect and psychologically superior people were allowed to qualify for air traffic controllers. That was not so prior to getting there. When I arrived in 2016, I made that change very early on because I always felt this was a job that, and other jobs too, but this was a job that had to be superior intelligence, and we didn't really have that, and we had it. And then when I left office and Biden took over, he changed them back to lower than ever before.
A lot of people would say that air traffic control is one of the most important jobs in the federal government. They keep millions, possibly billions of passengers safe a year. Over the years, the federal government has used a variety of processes to hire air traffic controllers. In the 1980s, there was an air traffic controller strike. As a result of that, a lot of new controllers were hired. There's also a mandatory age of 55 at which federal controllers must retire. The controllers that were hired in the early 80s were reaching mandatory retirement age, so the government started to look at the growing possibility of a controller shortage and looked at strategies to hire new controllers. The result of this was a barrier analysis that was published by the FAA in May of 2013. It found a lot of things, but one of the things that it found was that the air traffic controller sector was not very diverse, and the CTI programs, college training initiative programs, were also not very diverse. Now, this is where everything gets kind of muddy because there's a lot of information that is hearsay. There's a lot of information that was provided by whistleblowers. There's a lot of information that was provided by leaks, but the federal government has never openly acknowledged most of these things. Prior to 2014, the way that the majority of air traffic controllers were hired in the United States over the last 15 or so years was primarily through the College Training Initiative, or CTI, which was a partnership with as many as 35 colleges across the country that had air traffic control training integrated into their programs. I went to the University of Alaska, and at the University of Alaska, in the aviation training department, we had a CTI program. We had an air traffic control program where college graduates were basically expecting to go from there straight into the training program to become a fully qualified controller. The way that the government does hiring is through job openings. And when openings appear, they'll have this job, air traffic control specialist, would be open for a number of days, maybe 60, 90, whatever days, and it'll say who it's open to. Previously, the government would hire from veterans or CTI graduates, and if they did not get enough applicants through those two pools of people, then they would open the job to off-the-street candidates. It's hard to find data about how well the applicants did in their training. The process to become an air traffic controller is quite long, about 2 years, and involves a bunch of processes along the way. You go to an academy, then you go to a training facility, and you do on-the-job training. And along the way, there are specific criteria that you have to meet where you pass or fail and then are dropped. Depending on where you look, you can find numbers that say as few as 20% to as high as 70% of people who go into the air traffic control training track end up becoming fully qualified controllers. Some people self-select out, some people fail out, but it's hard to find actual concrete data on this. So in 2014, the decision was made to scrap the process that existed at the time of primarily taking CTI graduates and flowing them into the air traffic control training track, and then opening this up to a wide group of off-the-street hires. At the same time, there were a lot of diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives being promoted by the federal government, and a lot of people concluded that this was also a DEI program. The previous program, where most graduates of a CTI program would then take the ATSAT, which is the Air Traffic Control Selection Test. They would take that, and depending on how they did on that, they would be ranked Either they're fully are highly qualified, qualified, or not qualified. And at that point, they would be selected based on the number of applicants needed, and they would be put into the training track with the federal government. And a system was devised where off-the-street candidates and CTI grads and everybody would just take a biographical assessment. Now, this test has a lot of issues. A lot of people have cited this as being racist. This was the beginning of the process. It was like the gatekeeper. You had to pass this to move on in the process, where people who previously had taken the ATSAT would just have to take it again. The biographical assessment was criticized by some as being an attempt to promote diversity ahead of looking for the most qualified candidates. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I know that it is not uncommon for employers to require applicants to fill out a personality test or a biographical assessment where they rank employees. However, I think it's a little more uncommon in safety conscious positions. Some of the questions on this test, I'm going to go ahead and read to you. The number of college credits you've taken in art, music, dance, and drama is, and then it's a multiple choice question. I learned about the opportunity to apply for an air traffic control specialist job through, and then the options are a public notice or media advertisement, a friend or relative, college recruitment, working in some other capacity for the agency, or some other way. The number of different high school sports I participated in was, during my last year in college, my average number of hours of paid employment per week was, in the 3 years immediately before applying to this job, the number of different full or part-time jobs that I applied for was, the number of months I was unemployed during the 3 years immediately before applying to this job was, the number of college credits you have taken in art, music, dance, or drama is, in the 3 years prior to applying for this job, the number of formal suggestions I have submitted to my employer was, and so on and so forth. So not only was this questionnaire kind of odd, there were accusations that there was cheating involved. There was a leaked email from a member, I think the vice president of the National Black Coalition of Federal Aviation Employees, who suggested that the answers would be disseminated to a certain group of people, where the preferential answer for each of these questions would be outlined, and then people could answer them correctly per the test. There was also an email or a voicemail that was disseminated where the same thing was implied. Assuming that you did make it through the biographical questionnaire, you would then go on to take the ATSAT before being selected for training. In the previous process, you would take the ATSAT, then do an in-person interview to be selected for training. Only 15% of CTI graduates whose ATSAT scores listed them as qualified or highly qualified were selected through the biographical assessment to move on to while taking the ATSAT again and continuing with the process. In light of this, there have been numerous lawsuits filed, most notably Brigita versus Secretary Pete Butigeg, that is still in the courts. So all of this does sound pretty fishy to me. However, it's worth noting that in 2018, most of these conditions were reversed. So in 2018, the biographical assessment was reversed. In 2020, the preferential treatment given to CTI graduates was restored. And I do believe it's fair to say that President Trump is incorrect in asserting that the standards were lowered during the Obama administration. They were raised during the Trump administration. They were lowered again during the Biden administration. I don't find any evidence of that claim. It is worth noting that during the Biden administration, there were a whole lot of DEI initiatives that were pushed in the federal government, in the FAA. And even there were a lot of weird things that happened in the FAA that were in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, such as renaming the term NOTAMs, notices to airmen, to notices to air missions, in the light of not offending some people and being more inclusive. That initiative by itself doesn't prove anything, but it does send an interesting message to some that DEI was a higher priority to those in the higher level management of the FAA than safety was. I can't say for sure if that is true or not. I have no idea. I did not work for the FAA. I do not work for the FAA. I do believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion was a high priority during the Obama administration. And in some way, the changes to the processes in 2014 were a direct result of trying to cast a larger net and get a more diverse pool of applicants. These changes in policy, in my opinion, did create a disparate impact to those students who were at CTI schools. Students who spent thousands of their own dollars and went down the track to become air traffic controllers on their own accord, only to find out later that they would be disqualified through some arbitrary means. And these students weren't all white males. There were obviously females and minorities included in these groups and are named in the lawsuits. I believe that the goal of casting a wider net to get more applicants in the name of diversity did not meet its intended goal of getting a more diverse workforce. I don't think there's any evidence of that. And I think that it also probably did not have a direct impact on safety, as I don't believe the standards were lowered. However, it might have led to an increase in the controller shortage. If you look at the hiring numbers in 2013, 2014, hiring was delayed. And then if you look at the number of applicants who made it through training in the years that these initiatives were in place versus how many of them made it to the workforce, it's hard to know if there was an impact there. I find that President Trump bringing this up the day after the crash is in bad taste to some. However, I personally don't think it's any different than when a politician on the left brings up gun control, for instance, immediately after a mass shooting event. Politicians have their core issues. They have their issues that they've run on. Trump has been the anti-DEI candidate. So as gross as it is to me and probably most people, those candidates, whether they're anti-gun or anti-DEI or anti-whatever, if there's a politically expedient event that's going to allow them to talk about this topic, they're going to do that. I don't believe that Trump is any different than any other politician in that aspect. Obviously, I feel that we should be hiring the best and brightest controllers that we should find. And it should not matter if they're male, female, transgendered, black, white, Asian, or green. It doesn't matter. If you're qualified to do the job, right now we don't have enough controllers, and that is creating a problem, whether or not it was an impact in the DC crash. So we need to make sure we're not singling people out in the name of diversity. It doesn't matter if every person who applies to this job is white, or every person who applies to this job is male, or if 95% of them are male, or whatever. Having a more diverse workforce in this type of environment is not a strength. It is completely irrelevant. It's also not a weakness. It's completely irrelevant. It does not matter. Well, if you like this video, I'm going to continue to try to make more of them. Please like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Thank you.